To start thinking about visual metaphor, I want you to look at the following image, and I want you to ask yourself, what is the visual metaphor being used here? Well, most of you probably know who this character is, Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, and you'll remember that he was obsessed with the Ring of Power that had twisted him and extended his life and deformed him along the process, and not only his body but also his mind. What might the underlying visual metaphor be here? We have, instead of Gollum being obsessed with the One Ring, we have the little symbol for Facebook. Well, one of the root metaphors could be, one way of understanding this might be, that addiction is a disease, right? That could work, except that there might be a little bit more here, all right? So if we think about a disease, diseases usually aren't very intelligent, they're very invasive and damaging, but we usually don't attribute things like ideas and thoughts to them, all right? It's something that simply invades us and takes over. Here, maybe there's something a bit more, all right? That there's perhaps an intentional malevolence being communicated. Perhaps another way of thinking about this visual image is that the visual metaphor is addiction is control. All right, maybe that's the root metaphor here. The idea that when one is addicted, one's mind and body are influenced or controlled or are restricted or trapped, unable to see beyond the confines of one's prison, just like Gollum is unable to see beyond the confines of this ring of power. And then, of course, some critics of social media might say that it traps us into thinking in one way or obsessing over it or being addicted to it and only seeing what is being presented on the social media platform. So maybe in grade school you had a teacher that differentiated between metaphor and analogy and simile, maybe. I'm not really interested in those literary distinctions. Essentially, a metaphor is an analogy. An analogy is a similarity between things that are otherwise dissimilar. The operation of a computer presents an interesting analogy to the workings of the brain, for instance, right? So, a visual analogy or visual metaphor uses visual forms or visual imagery to establish this similarity between two things that are otherwise different. Now, there are a couple things that we can think about when trying to bridge the gap between two things are different. There are a couple of things that we can think about in terms of making a metaphor or how to make a metaphor. So if you want to make a visual analogy, if you want to make a metaphor, think about how the two things that you're trying to make a connection between, think about how they look or think about what they do. And another way of saying that is to identify how the things have similar shapes or similar structures. In other words, how do they look kind of alike in some way? Or do the two things in question have similar functions? Do they do something that is similar? All right. So that's kind of a first step, actually, when you want to make a visual analogy or a visual metaphor, is to analyze the two things that you're trying to understand, one in terms of the other, the two things that you're trying to bring together, analyze them in terms of how they look, or analyze them in terms of what they do. In some cases, you'll be able to make a connection between two things, both in terms of how they look and also what they do. Then trying to forge a single shape or single image or single picture that brings these elements together. Finally, you might decide what your goal is for your artwork. So in some graphic design projects or in graphic design assignments, or if you're out there in the world, you might be given a brief, and it might be really important that the metaphor that you're using is really clear and easily understood by people, right? So after you have identified, oh, these two things kind of look alike in this way, or these two things do something similar, and I can make a metaphor based on that, right? And then you bring them together, and you think you've got this great visual metaphor, verify that other people can understand that visual metaphor clearly, if clarity is your goal, all right? Just ask them, do you get it? However, sometimes we don't necessarily want clarity. We want people to ask themselves questions. We might want to evoke wonder. We might want people to reflect. We might want a certain emotion that is conjured with our work. So subtlety might be our goal. And then if you're trying to be too clear, you're actually making the power of your visual metaphor less. So how you use a visual metaphor is really important. And what your goal is really important. Are you trying to be super clear? Are you trying to be subtle? Are you trying to evoke wonder? What is your goal in this artwork? So a visual analogy or a visual metaphor is based on similarities between how two things look, their structures, or how two things work, their functions, what they do, right? So let's look at the sculpture by Willie Cole. You see this iron, and you see feathers, and the feathers apparently are very hot and flamey. I want you to ask yourself, how is this visual metaphor, how is this visual analogy being made? So I want you to ask yourself, what is the source of this visual analogy? Is it based on what two different things do? Or is it based on how two different things look? So here we have an iron. Irons create heat. Yes, they create steam, but that steam is hot usually not a cool mist. And we could get burned by irons. And then we see in this sculpture, we apparently have flames coming out of the iron. So it's building off this idea that the iron is hot, right? And so we look at the flames, and then we realize that the flames are really feathers. Now, there's not a lot that feathers and, say, heat have in common, though maybe in some other artwork we do find a way that feathers and heat have something in common. But in this case, it's not so much what the feathers and heat or fire do that's the basis of the visual analogy. It's how the feathers look, and it's how fire looks, or at least a representation of fire in our head. It's the structural similarity, the way we think fire looks, the way we see the feathers. That's the basis of this particular visual analogy. Notice that we could turn our gas range on, and we might see that the fire there is blue. All right. So the artist is being very selective. But if you ask most people to draw some fire and give them a variety of markers, most probably would use red and yellow to draw the fire. So this is a kind of a cultural understanding of what fire looks like, and it's making the visual analogy based on what we understand fire to look like and what the feathers look like in terms of kind of flamey red and orange shapes. Here's another example by the artist Willie Cole. And I want you to ask yourself, first of all, what are you looking at? Secondly, what is the visual analogy here? And how is it made? Is the visual analogy made based on how something looks, how two different things look, or is the visual analogy based on what two different things do, how they function, how they work? So in this case, we see a vaguely humanesque form. The humanesque form might remind you of a female figure or a Venus of Willendorf, for instance, a prehistoric figure. And then we notice that looking at this, the figure is made out of shoes. So we can start to unpack this visual analogy by asking ourselves, is the analogy based on what shoes, something similar between what shoes do and people do? Or is it based on what the shoes look like and what people look like? So in this case, while we can think of maybe shoes as doing something related to movement, and we can also think of people as moving. In this case, the actual artwork is based on not so much on what shoes and people do as what the shoes put together in this way, what the shoes look like and what people look like. So the shoes are put together in a vaguely human form. And so the visual metaphor or the visual analogy here is based on how the shoes look and how people look.